Our first reading this morning is from the Old Testament book of Psalms. This is a psalm of David, chapter 103, verses 10 through 14. He doesn't deal with us according to our sin or repay us according to our wrongdoing. Because as high as heaven is above the earth, that's how large God's faithful love is for those who honor him. As far as east is from west, that's how far God has removed our sin from us. Like a parent feels compassion for their children, that's how the Lord feels compassion for those who honor him. Because God knows how we're made, God remembers we are just dust. Our gospel lesson is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 18, verses 21 through 35. This is the parable of the unforgiving servant. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, how many times should I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Should I forgive as many as 7 times?" Jesus said, "Not just 7 times, but rather as many as 77 times. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle accounts, they brought to him a servant who owed him 10,000 bags of gold. Because the servant didn't have enough to pay it back, the master ordered that he should be sold, along with his wife and children and everything he had, and that the proceeds should be used as payment. But the servant fell down, kneeled before him, and said, 'Please, be patient with me, and I'll pay you back.' The master had compassion on that servant, released him, and forgave the loan. Then that servant went out. He found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 coins. He grabbed him around the throat and said, 'Pay me back what you owe me.' Then his fellow servant fell down and begged him, 'Be patient with me, I'll pay you back.' But he refused. Instead, he threw him into prison until he paid back his debt. When his fellow servants saw what happened, they were deeply offended. They came and told their master all what had happened. The master called the first servant and said, 'You wicked servant, I forgave you all the debt because you appealed to me. Shouldn't you also have mercy on your fellow servant, just as I had mercy on you?' His master was furious and handed him over to the guard responsible for punishing prisoners until he had paid the whole debt. My heavenly Father will also do the same to you if you don't forgive your brother or sister from your heart."
So the question posed is, what does it mean to forgive and be forgiven? Anything stand out to you in that reading initially? It's probably one you've heard before, at least the first part. Who here finds forgiveness easy? Nobody. Forgiveness, for being one of those foundational concepts of the Christian faith, is awfully difficult for us to grasp. How many people have been hurt by somebody else? Everybody. If you didn't raise your hand, I'm just raising it for you in my head. How many people have hurt somebody else? We all have. We all have hurt people. We all have been hurt. But the question posed to Jesus, have you noticed that when people approach Jesus with a question, The meaning behind their question is often, how do I get around this requirement? That's really the motivation for the question. That's how we got the story of the Good Samaritan. Jesus says, to the rich young man, what are the greatest commandments? Quotes Deuteronomy. Love God, love your neighbor. Jesus says, you're right. Follow-up question. Well, who's really my neighbor? And that gets us the Good Samaritan. So how many times do you have to forgive somebody? I mean, when do you reach the limit and then you don't have to do it anymore? 7? 7 sounds like a lot. Jesus responds, no. Not 7, but 77, an exponentially larger number. Don't take that to mean that after 77, they're cut off. That is not what he's saying. But what has been your experience with forgiveness? Is it something you struggle with? For yourself? Yeah, oftentimes forgiveness is confused with setting healthy boundaries with other people. And maybe a good place to start with forgiveness is talking about what forgiveness isn't. Because there's a ton of confusion as to what forgiveness is. Is forgiveness the same as saying I'm sorry? I think that can be part of it. It's that idea of you recognize that you did something. And you seek that person's forgiveness. I think most of the time when we say we're sorry, I don't know if we mean it. Yeah. As the oldest of 5 girls, her sister needs to forgive her. So what forgiveness isn't? So letting go in order to open up. Yeah, if you look at the definition of forgiveness from a medical or psychological perspective, letting go is what shows up most often. Letting go of regret, letting go of regret and grudges. Is how the psychological world defines forgiveness. It's hardest to forgive yourself. I think that is the hardest thing we do. It is way harder for us to recognize that we can let go of those grudges against ourselves. Because for whatever reason, we like to hold on. Forgiveness is not giving someone license to repeatedly hurt you. It's not what it is. So forgiveness is not giving someone license to repeatedly hurt you, because that is how forgiveness is misused in abusive relationships. You have to forgive me because you follow Jesus. And Jesus said you have to forgive me. Therefore, I can just keep hurting you. No, that's not what forgiveness is. And that's not what Jesus tells us to do. So, it's not giving someone license to hurt. It's also not condoning what another person did. You can forgive somebody, and also there are consequences for their actions. So, kind of an extreme example, years ago there was a school shooting at an Amish school in Pennsylvania. I think it was 2 days after that community released a statement forgiving the shooter. Obviously they wouldn't go on camera, they're not doing interviews, they're Amish. but they released a statement saying they forgive the shooter. They did not advocate for the shooter not to face the criminal justice system as consequence for their action. So it's not condoning what the person did. Those things are separate. There are consequences for our actions as a society. Now, sometimes you do have people, victims and families, who will over time start advocating for the person who was put into prison. Through the act of forgiveness, they have formed a relationship over time. They see the change in that person, and they seek that person's release at parole. They're not condoning what they did. They're recognizing the change in them, and that they deserve to live life and have a second chance. Those two things, I think, are how forgiveness gets abused the most. It's a license to hurt, or you can't forgive me and then advocate for punishment for me for what I did when it's a broken law. The challenge with forgiveness is that when we harbor that resentment, when we harbor those grudges, it is detrimental to us in body, mind, and spirit. Detrimental. It has physiological effects on us. It increases our stress level, causes all kinds of things like heart disease, and increases risk of strokes and ulcers. And it's detrimental to us physically when we hold grudges. And often, and I dealt with this a lot leading an inpatient recovery class on forgiveness. Often the other person isn't even aware of what you're harboring. This happened all the time when people were making their list of who they had to approach and make amends for what they did to them. A lot of the time, that person had no idea what they were talking about. They've thought about it for 20 years. It has consumed them, and the other person has no idea what they're even talking about. So when we hold that grudge, there's an old, story, holding a grudge is like drinking poison, expecting it to kill the other person. It's not hurting them. It's hurting us. Yeah, forgiveness is a process. There are stages and steps to it. It is not something that you just have to do, and it's not something you do right away. Forgiveness takes time. And forgiveness is messy because it exists in relationship with other people. Which means if you have done something and hurt somebody, you are on their timeline for forgiveness. You can approach them, seek their forgiveness. They don't have to give it to you right away, or ever. You just have to be okay with that. You're on their timetable. And maybe they get to the point where they're ready to do that, or maybe they don't. There's nothing you can do about it. So it's messy. Forgiveness work is messy. And it takes time for us too. If someone approaches you seeking forgiveness, resist the urge to, out of a knee-jerk reaction, say, "Oh yeah, I forgive you," if you don't. I'm learning this whole Minnesota nice, which way more direct than you were all used to. So how do you forgive someone who did something hurtful but refuses to admit that they did something hurtful? That's hard. Because generally the first step in forgiveness is someone recognizing what they did and seeking forgiveness. And that's where the dynamics of forgiveness aren't about the other person. You have to make the choice to forgive them, regardless of if they recognize it or not, for your own benefit. Now, that may mean that you cease being in a relationship with that person. Because you really need that element to continue a healthy relationship. So there might need to be a pause or a break that one day will then be allowed to be healed. But it takes both people to be involved in a relationship. So some of the hardest thing is when that other person doesn't or won't recognize what they did. So when someone does something to you and you get angry, you have to find a way to get rid of the anger in order to forgive. Yeah, I think you have to find outlets to work through the anger. I don't know that you're ready to forgive in an honest way if you're really angry. That seems to kind of get in the way of that. Because your anger is not going to miraculously disappear because you say you forgive that person. The anger is going to be there, which is still going to get in the way. On the flip side of that, that's going to rear its head again. Sometimes we're going to get angry, even after we've forgiven somebody. But it's a complicated thing. I think when we genuinely forgive, that anger subsides if we have an outlet for it that is healthy. If we're not just saying, I'm not allowed to be angry. Sometimes anger is an appropriate response to when someone hurts us.
I think sometimes you need to act as if and forgive yourself.
Yeah, so kind of act as if you've forgiven and then forgiveness comes. That's a 12-step thing. The fake it till you make it. It's this idea that you don't change internally first, you change externally first, and the internal catches up. And I think there's value to that. I think that applies to most things in our lives. And I think that can work to get the forgiveness process started sometimes, or to help let go of anger. There's a fine line between bottling up and kind of trying to move forward while still having that stuff in.
So I was really struggling once with something and the person was dead.
Yeah.
And I was being advised by someone spiritually to forgive that person. And I remember saying to her, I tried, but every time I think I've forgiven him, something new comes up. And I remember why.
Yeah.
And she said to me, don't you realize forgiveness is not a matter of healing, it's a matter of death. And we need to just, every time something comes up, we need to say, God, I will forgive this person, and I ask you to take care of the healing. And I did that for like 3 months, and these were popping up all the time. And finally, after 3 months, I remembered something good about that person. And it was such a gift.
So she had someone who had died, who she needed to work on forgiveness with, and was working with someone, and the person she was working with said, forgiveness is not a feeling, it is a will to do something. It's a choice to make. So that every time something popped up or a new thing was remembered, she would say out loud to herself, I will to forgive this person. And then eventually over time, not all the things that popped up were bad things. They were good things. Sometimes it's a choice to surrender the pain that you carry. Absolutely. Here's the thing about forgiveness. Forgiveness is a choice. A choice taken in full knowledge of what that person did. It's a choice we have to make actively. We have to choose it. It doesn't passively happen magically apart from us. So it's a choice that at some point, when you're ready, you say, I remember everything about how you hurt me. I choose to forgive you, to not hold it against you. So that means when you're in an argument with that person, and it's real convenient to bring that up again, you can't do that. Because that's holding it against them. You haven't forgiven them if you're doing that. But it's a conscious choice. It's an active choice to forgive somebody, including ourselves. We have to choose to forgive ourselves, and to stop holding things against ourselves. Choice. But in the act of forgiveness is freedom. We're no longer burdened by that pain. It's letting go of the pain. It does lessen over time. Relationships can be healed, sometimes to a healthier level than they were over time. Here's the other thing with forgiveness, and this is what our passage talks about. We cannot both hold things against others and experience God's forgiveness at the same time. We cannot hold things against others and experience God's forgiveness at the same time. The first interferes with the second. If we are holding things, actively holding grudges against others, we are not in a place spiritually or emotionally to receive God's forgiveness. It gets in the way. The offer is there. It's not God withholding forgiveness from us. The offer of forgiveness is there, but we are not in a space to receive it. It gets in the way. That's what this text in Matthew is talking about. This is not a threat. It's told in a parable form. But it's this idea that if you are not free with your forgiveness of others, you cannot receive that forgiveness from God. You're not ready. How can we forgive who? Yeah. It's a choice. It's a choice that doesn't condone what he's doing or give him license to keep doing it. It's not going to matter in the grand scheme of things or alter what's happening in Ukraine. But it will affect us. If we look at another person and just seethe in anger and wish ill upon them, it's going to affect us. And it's going to get in the way of our relationship with God, and it's going to get in the way with our relationship with others. It's going to turn us into bitter, angry people. Has anyone ever been around someone who's just a bitter, angry person? Is that enjoyable? You want to spend all your time with that person? The worst deaths I have ever been a witness to in the hospital, there's only a couple, are people who are just bitter, angry people. They couldn't get their pain under control, no matter how much medicine they gave them. They were restless in the bed. They had this scowl on their face. It was horrible to watch. They could find no peace. Bitterness is poison to us. It kills our spirit. He said when we started, he started to question if he's ever really forgiven anyone. And then in thinking he has, but it did alter those relationships, and it did change trust. And that's an important point. Trust is earned. Forgiveness is freely given. Trust is earned. Forgiveness is freely given. So forgiving someone does not restore them to trust if they have hurt you. Trust takes time to rebuild. It has to be earned. So those two things are not the same. You can forgive someone and say, I can't be in a relationship with you. And that's okay. That's might be the best thing for you to be a healthy person. To say, I can't be in a relationship with you. Sometimes the relationship is not mendable. The hurt is that bad. That doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. That's why this is complicated, messy stuff. But the vital part is getting to that forgiveness, regardless of what happens with the relationship. To make sure you're not holding on to bitterness, holding on to anger, and poisoning yourself. So that we are open and free to receive God's forgiveness. Here's where it's so important to reclaim something called spiritual disciplines. When I teach confirmation, I'm not going to quiz you, Will, but we talked about this idea that faith was a practice. It's active. It's like working out a muscle. So think of faith like a muscle that you have to exercise all the time, or it atrophies away. You ever seen someone's legs who have been wheelchair bound for 20 years? It's just bone and skin. There's no muscle there. Faith has to be exercised. And for the history of the church, there have been these things called spiritual disciplines. These practices people do daily. Things like prayer and worship, forgiveness, joy and celebration, simplicity, silence. All of these things that help us exercise our faith. We have to work out our forgiveness muscles. It does become easier to forgive the more we do it. Like anything else, it's a muscle to practice and to work. The same is true on the flip side. If our default is holding on to grudges and bitterness and anger, it becomes real easy to do that. It's our default setting. It's the muscles we're working, and they're healthy. We have to practice. And it's not a one-time deal most of the time. Forgiveness takes time. So here's what I want you to remember, though. Forgiveness is the cornerstone of the Christian faith. It is what the Christian faith is built on. This idea that God gives this free gift of forgiveness is unique to the Christian faith among religions. We call it grace, this free gift given to us. We don't earn it. There's nothing we can do to earn it from God, and yet God gives it freely to us. It's God's choice to give that to us, to give forgiveness, to give mercy, to give love, to give compassion, kindness. It's God's free, chosen gift for us. So don't harbor on the things that God has already forgiven. The Psalm said, God doesn't remember those things. When we seek forgiveness, God doesn't hold on to them. Apparently God can forgive and forget, we can't. But so many of us walk away from a time of confession carrying the same load we brought in. We didn't really set it down. Forgiveness is vital to being in community with others. You broke relationship permanently. With every time there was a hurt between two people, we would all be on islands, alone. It's vital to being in relationships that are healthy. Any last questions or thoughts on forgiveness? Yeah, so it seems like an addition if the free forgiveness doesn't come if we hold something against someone else. I look at it like this. The forgiveness is there for us to receive. It gets in the way of us doing that by holding forgiveness from others. I just don't think we're open to it spiritually, to actually receive it. We might say we do, but I don't think we're capable of receiving God's forgiveness if we're withholding forgiveness from others. It just gets in the way. We're just not in a place to even receive something. Other last questions or thoughts? In the fall, I'm planning, rather than doing any weekly Bible studies or classes after Sunday, I'm going to do 3 ongoing once-a-month groups. And one of them is going to be spiritual practices and disciplines. So once a month, it'll be on first, second, or third Sunday after church. But where we practice these things in our lives, in our weeks, we try them out, so that you can find the practices that nourish your faith. Because it's vital to practice our faith in these ways. All right. Next week, the next 2 weeks, I've got several questions about the Bible. So we're going to do Bible questions part 1 and part 2 over the next 2 weeks. If you think of more Bible questions, have them ready.